welcome to this presentation. My name is Donk Orleone, and today we're going to talk about second barreling. The things we're going to learn, we're going to structure in a few blocks. We're going to talk about the building blocks of the second barrel. So we're going to divide the morphology, the shape of the range into different parts. We're going to explore how to play those different parts. We're going to talk about overbet merging. I added it as a point because I knew a lot of people would find it fancy and gimmicky and they would like it. Basically, it's one of the building blocks of the morphology of the barrel is going to be the merges. Adjusting to the runout, of course, we're going to want to learn about different cards where we might bet bigger, smaller, higher frequency, lower frequency, and why. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about how to punish some of the mistakes that have to do with this node. Range interaction. Okay, so let's set up the fundamentals of the spot. We c-bet the flop and we get called. Our opponent has a condensed range. We're calling our c-bet, especially if we c-bet small. Why? Because if they had a really strong hand, they would have raised more often than not. And if they had a really weak hand, they would have folded more often than not. So they have a very, very high density of middling hands. And therefore, in comparison, we have a higher density of strong and weak hand. We have an excess of air, and we have a nut advantage to this fact. Nut advantage versus a condensed range leads to big sizing. So this is why in a high SPR scenario, a single raise pot, 100 big blinds deep, after c-betting the flop, small sizing, half pot, 3/4 even, a lot of the time the turn size is going to be pot, overbet. It's going to be like the default sizing for a lot of runout. And the reason is because what I just said, our opponent called, which means he didn't either fold or raise. What he didn't do is almost more important than what he did. And that leads to a more polarized strategy from our. So let's talk about the building block. The first building block and what drives the strategy, the most important part of the range is the value, right? Value is something like a type of hand that we bet in order to grow the pot. And the reason to bet on the turn rather than check and bet the river is because we have some incentive to bet now rather than later. What could be one incentive to bet now rather than later? It could be, for example, the fact that we want to bet twice. If we want to bet now and later, then that's a pretty good incentive for betting the turn. Another incentive could be the fact that we can fold out hands that are drawing against us. If you have a top pair, we'll see an example later, but on a queen high board, the queen jack hand has a little bit higher of an incentive for betting than the king queen, like the top pair with the king, right? Because we're going to fold out some king x and ace x, and having one protection from overcards makes it a little bit less important to bet the turn. There's some level of protection there, but you will see it's a very minimal effect. It's very common for people to blow out of proportion the amount of protection that a hand needs. You'll see there is some effect like that, but it's a rather small one. And the main incentive for betting the turn is the fact that you want to bet now and later. Draws. Well, draws have a lot of similarities to value in that one of the reasons to bet is to grow the pot now in case we hit. So we're growing the pot now in case we want to bet now and later too. And along the way, we're getting fold equity and such, so it works as a bluff. But also, if we do hit, we would rather be in the big pot than in the small pot. With air, we force our opponent to call bluff catcher. Okay, the problem if we just play like old school, run-of-the-mill, cookie cutter poker, bet with value and bet with draws. The problem with that is that bluff catchers rarely have any incentive to call. It's almost like if you had a hand that's good enough to continue, you might want to just raise because the betting range is so equity driven. And when you have a bluff catcher that's too weak, you might as well just fold because you're just, even if you're ahead right now of some hands, the equity that those hands have is just too high, and our equity is just not enough with bluff catchers all the time. So betting with a range of only value and draws, generally not a good strategy on the turn, especially in position. Out of position, it's not as clear, but in position, certainly not a good. Therefore, we need air. And then the other building block is going to be the merge. Okay? And the merges are hands that are kind of in between that old school poker advice would be to not bet because it just doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you take a second pair or a third pair and overbet, right? You're just going to make him fold air and call with top pair. Makes no sense. Well, as we will see, does make sense, actually. It does make sense. And the point is to force our opponent to defend with a lower equity range. What does that mean? Well, there are going to be a lot of boards where the bluff catchers with a higher rank actually have a lower equity versus a polarized range than bluff catchers with a lower rank. For example, we will look at an example where there's like a low straight on board. And so a high bluff catcher, like a second pair, right, or a pocket pair like tens, that's rather high, might actually have less equity versus a polar range than a hand like 4-3, which could be like a board pair with a gut shot, right? And that type of defense where very low rank hands have higher equity versus a polar range can be punished very harshly if you start betting hands in the middle, because if the player starts folding tens but calling 4-3 with a pair and a gut shot, then if you bet a second pair or a third pair, you're going to be punishing that type of strategy a lot harder. So that's the point for merging. So we're going to look at the range composition on this board, in this runout and action. It's a polar strategy. As we said, we're going to be using an overbet sizing, and we're going to look at the unintuitive, quote unquote, unintuitive air and merge. So here's the board. We see bet, look at the range composition. Not quite a range bet, but slightly more polar than a range bet, right? And the calls, as we said, which is going to be condensed. The calls are going to have to do with this type of hand class. So overbet sizing, 180% or so. And actually, this sim is the one that I node logged after. Check some things. Let me remove the node log. There you go. And as we can see, there is a value section, very clear. There is a bluff section, which we will divide between draws and air. We'll look at it later. And then we have this section in the middle, which kind of seems to, not fit either a bluff or value. Well, let's look at that at first. Third pair, and let's do flush draw, combo draw, and flush draw to the nuts. And we see basically every single one is betting. The reason is why. Overbet, we're going to get lots of folds from second pair with no draw. If second pair has no draw, it basically just folds always, essentially. And under pair basically just folds. So actually, almost every single bluff catcher that is higher than a 5 fold. And there's going to be hands like third pair, low pair, and ace high with flush draw, etc. that are at least sometimes calling. They are at least sometimes calling. Now, imagine if your opponents were going to call 6, sixes specifically hurts the 5. Imagine if your opponents were to call 4s or to call 6-3 or 4-3, right? Your opponents call these hands, if they start calling ace-6 with the gut shot, that would be even better, right? So, imagine if your opponents start calling those hands, then betting the 5 becomes even a bigger punishment to their strategy. They are being too equity driven with their calls, right? You can punish them with those 5x bet, right? Like it would not be hard to imagine someone, for example, folding pure with these couple hands right here, right? Just folding and then calling with a 6-3. It's not completely out of this world, that possible strategy, right? And then betting the 5 would be even better. So that's the merge, okay? Overbet merging. We're gonna have the value, which is pretty straightforward, right? The value is mostly composed of hands that you want to bet now and bet later, right? So in this case, king, queen, and queen jack are rarely going to value bet the river as well, right? So the value range is basically the hands that are going to triple barrel and then a little bit more. And you can see that the queen jack hand is a little bit more benefited from betting than a hand that, like king queen. The reason is because queen jack doesn't have an overcard, king queen does, and when you bet, you fold out overcard. That's the point. So nothing too special or unintuitive. Notice though that, funnily enough, the hands that we start betting almost coincide exactly with where our range advantage resides. So we don't have a full range advantage, as we can see in the ranges here. We don't have a full range advantage, right? Here, we're actually doing pretty badly at the middle and bottom part of the range. But up here, we're doing really, really well. So, funnily enough, the value almost coincides, I won't say exactly, but the value coincides pretty well with where our advantage starts, right? As you can see here, if we look at this hand class breakdown, right? we see that we have actually 45% equity as the button. So we're actually at a quote unquote disadvantage in terms of raw equity because we have a lot of air and bad hand and our opponent doesn't, right? But we have a higher EV. Why? How can we have a lower equity and a higher EV? Some people might say, oh, you're in position. If you're in position, you have a higher EV. That is partly true, but even more true, it's even more true that a polarized range over realizes its equity and a condensed range under realizes it. So that's also why our range has more EV. And if we look at the hand class breakdown, we see that we have more straights, more sets, and about the same amount of two pairs, more over pairs, and top pairs we actually have less. Why do we have less top pairs? Well, because our opponent is removing a lot of bad hands from his range. He just has a lot less combos in his range. See, 224 combos in his total range because he folded a lot, right? So we have actually less top pair, but what we're going to have more of, if you just use your eyes, is good top pair, okay? Good top pairs we have more of, right? So pretty funny that the hands that start value betting are almost exactly the hands where you start seeing an advantage in the buttons rank, right? So it's not all top pairs, as we saw. In fact, we have less top pairs overall, but past Queen Jack, we actually have a lot more good hands than our opponent, okay? So funnily enough, the value range coincides almost exactly, almost always, with where exactly your advantage lies. Let's look at the bluff. We're going to divide it in draws, as we said, and then we'll look at some non-draw. So the first thing to notice is that not all draws are betting. Reasons for this, well, there's multiple reasons. Board coverage would be one. We want to be able to not just get shoved on every time we check back and the flush completes, right? That would be good. We would want to not have, not be completely value heavy when we bet and a flush complete. But also there's reasons that are more micro, like for example, some flush draws might prefer betting because you fold out higher flush draws maybe, while some other flush draws might not want to bet because you fold out worse flush. Like that could be a reason to divide your flush draws in both lines. Same for straight draws, right? Like some straight draws dominate others. Like multiple straight draws are going to hit the straight on the same card. For example, 8-6 is going to hit the straight on a 4, right? Or one of the straights are going to be hit on a 4. So if you bet with 8-6 and you fold out a 1-6, that could decrease your implied odds. So that's another reason why you might put some draws in one line, other draws in another. You want to cooler worse draws whenever you both hit the same hand or the same, right? Like you hit like a slightly better straight, or you want to avoid getting cooler. When you have 1-4, you bet way more often. When you have, or when you have 1-6, you have way more often than when you have 8-6. So that's one little idea that might help you structure your draws a little bit better. And then there's the non-draw. And this is something that a lot of people miss. And you might say, I mean, it's only 16%. If we go right now and we no-lock these hands out, the folds are going to probably go through the roof, right? Or at least a decent amount higher. This is a 66% fold. 66% fold versus the overbet. Let's just go to the non-draw and let's try to remove those and see what happens. I'm not sure how much it will fold, but it will certainly be more. We'll try again because, okay. So it would be non-draw. Oh, whoop, definitely messed it up. Would be non-draw, no made hand, king high, and we're just going to do that, lock all. So now we're betting a similar range except no pure air. And long and behold, we do not like calling versus this range at all. Okay, I knew it was going to start falling a lot more. I didn't expect this kind of thing, but notice how before in one of the previous slides, one of my points about the reason why we have to bet air is because even if you bet a lot of draws, your opponent is going to start just defending raise or fold if you start betting only draws. Let's say, okay, let me bluff more, right? I'm not going to bluff air. I'm just going to bluff more draws, more draws, more draws. Well, your opponent is just going to defend, like he's going to just raise way more instead of calling more, which is what we want, right? If we bet a draw, we don't want to get raised. So, yeah, I mean, that's 16 or 15% of air. That seems like, I mean, do I RNG 10% of bluffs all the time? Like, who cares, right? It seems to be quite impactful to our opponent's strategy. Scene asks, is that why we are checking back the high suited ace-x combos? Yes, that's part of the reason, I would say. And also, in this particular positions, bottom versus big blind, single raise pot, a hand like ace 10 or ace 9 just has a decent amount of showdown value. So that's also a reason to potentially not bet a hand like ace 10, even if you have a flush draw. But as you saw, king 10 with the flush draw also doesn't bet. And king 10 with a flush draw is more fitting the model that I'm talking about, where you're just going to get called by the ace, right? If you bet king, jack, king 10 of hearts, you're going to get called by the ace of hearts. You're going to fold out like a jack 10 of hearts or a jack 9 of hearts or something like that. You're going to fold those out. So it can actually do really poorly for your coolering potential. James asks, if we face an opponent who overcalls versus this strat, how does that affect our EV? Well, if he overcalls versus the value and draws only strategy, well, then it would be not that bad, right? If your opponents are not exploiting you, then you making a mistake or a frequency imbalance, then it's not going to hurt you that much, right? But then you could find a new counter strategy to them, to their calls, right? Of course, if they never raise, if they just call or fold, then being very value heavy and then betting pretty strong draws only as bluffs, quote unquote bluffs. Let's say they could even underfold, right? They don't fold enough. Then betting only value and then like a few really strong bluff draws would be a really strong exploit against that. So in poker, yes, there's an equilibrium strategy and there's the ideal perfect way to build ranges, but in practice, it's a lot like rock, paper, scissors, where I can't tell you that something is always completely wrong, right? Is throwing paper always bad? Well, I mean, it's not ideal in the GTO sense, but if your opponent is throwing rock, then yeah, just throw paper all the time, right? But then throwing paper could be terrible if your opponent is throwing scissors all the time. So yeah, let's go and talk about the morphology of that. Basically, what you will see very often is that having some kind of benefit to the air is a little bit better than not, right? So having one overcard to the air is slightly better than not, right? Or having maybe a heart, right? Like a flush draw blocker or something, right? Sometimes you will see bets with like complete dust, but generally you will see they have some sliver of a benefit, right? But you need to be careful with that logic though, because right now I'm just saying, okay, if you have air, you can structure your air by betting more with a king and not as much without a king. That could be your logic for betting with air. But what if the flop has an ace instead of a queen? Then you cannot have an overcard. There's no overcard that exists. So how are you going to structure the air? Okay, now you need a different heuristic. The problem with heuristics is that as soon as you change one variable, it can all go south, right? So make sure that you understand the idea that the point is not that overcards bet and non-overcards don't bet as much. Point is that you need to pick some air, and it so happens that on the queen you have some overcards to pick from, but on an ace you wouldn't, so you would have to pick air some other way. James says, feel like villains at my stakes would not exploit that. Well, it's not about what villains, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, but it's not about what your opponents wouldn't exploit. It's about what you are going to exploit. Don't use what your opponents are not able to do as an excuse for you having a less developed strategy. More so, learn from what your opponents are doing actually in practice and try to find a way to take advantage of that. Take a more, instead of a defensive approach where, are they going to attack this? Are they going to attack that? You can have that thought, but mainly think about, okay, how am I going to attack what they're doing? Scene says, if they're overcalling, then your air balls will be minus EV. Yes, sure. Alexander says, is blasting with the heart also intended so that you also blast on flush completed boards on the river? Well, as you can see, that heuristic is okay in terms of like in practice. Lots of solver little combo heuristics are not that important, let's just say, right? Like the fact that here heart is better is barely better, non-heart is still betting still, right? So those heuristics are very, very, very like not that impactful in actual solver, but you can use them yourself if you want to have a more structured thought, right? Instead of like spending 5 minutes building a betting range, it's just like, okay, well, I mean, when I have a heart, I'll just bet, and without a heart, I won't. That could be a bit of a quicker shortcut to it. In my opinion, I don't think that the reason to bet with a heart on the turn, I don't think it's to bet again on the river on a flush. Although you would, if you bet with a heart, you're gonna have a good blocker. If the flush completes, you would generally bluff the river as well. The reason probably has more to do with the current blockers that you have, right? You have like probably slightly better blockers and unblockers on the current street. In some cases, at least, when you have a suit than when you don't, because you're blocking board pairs with the suit, you're blocking ace high with the suits. So I would say that that's mainly the reason. But yes, if the flush completes, you generally bluff again. So Dylan says hearts also just blocking more of the villains continues. Basically what I just said, but more concise. Ben, the solver doesn't bluff the hearts on the turn so that it can bluff the river. Having the hearts is just good on the turn, and then the heart comes on the river, we can bluff. Amazing. I would argue the opposite. You don't want a heart because you want him to have more heart draws that has to fold, in my opinion. And in some spots, that is actually true. It depends on the specific spot, whether he has more flush draws that fold or call, or more pairs with a flush draw, or more ace highs with a flush draw. In this particular case, it's probably a good blocker. Having the heart is probably like a slightly better blocker than not. But there are spots where it's just bad. For instance, generally, if you bet big, really big on flop, then it's not as good to have the heart on turn, because your opponent's range is very, 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 very heavy on flush draws that call then fold. But it depends a little bit. It's not, what I would say is it's not that important. Michael says, need to be a bit of a clairvoyant to determine if villain is only betting value. Yes, you never know what your opponents are doing exactly, but by studying GTO, for example, as well as many other techniques, by studying GTO, you can get a sense for what you didn't know before you looked at GTO, right? A lot of the time you will look at GTO and be like, oh, I would have never guessed that this is how you have to play the spot, right? And if you haven't guessed it, your opponents probably haven't either. And so by studying more deeply than your opponents, you can find what the gap is between their understanding and the actual correct strategy. And you can infer not their exact strategy, but probably the sort of mistakes they're going to be made, right? All right, let's talk about the structure of air to summarize what we just looked at. Overcards, generally better. Unblockers to folds are generally better. So, for example, if the flop has a backdoor flush draw and it doesn't keep going on the turn, then blocking the backdoor flush draws becomes pretty bad. The flop is hard diamond. You bet the flop and you get called. Having diamonds on the turn is usually not going to be great unless a diamond comes. Blockers to flush draws are generally better. Not always, as we talked about, but they're generally better because a lot of flush draws continue actually on the turn. Still, pairs plus flush draw, combo draws, not flush draws, and sometimes we can't wait for a pretty hand, okay? A lot of players get stuck in this aesthetic way of playing poker. Like, I'm waiting for the pretty hand, and I bluff when I have a pretty hand, and I won't bluff when I don't have a pretty hand, okay? That's not a good way of playing, because in some spots, you're going to have a lot of pretty hands in your range. In some spots, you're going to have none. And it would be kind of predictable that you would bluff more if your hands are prettier overall, and you would bluff less if your hands are not pretty overall. And that would be a bit of a tell that you have without even realizing. The runout. Some runouts equalize the nut advantage, okay? This means that the turn we saw generally keeps our range very polarized compared to our opponent, but not always, right? Some runouts are going to be like a flush completer or certain cards that give in this case, the big blind, top of range, at least equality to us. Runouts can be better or worse for our betting volume. If a turn gives us a lot of new value, then we're going to have more value bets, and therefore we're going to have more bluff to balance that out. But if a runout kind of weakens our value, it might be that we have less value bets and therefore less bluffs and a lower betting volume overall. Some runouts have more or less draw candidates, right? There's going to be turns where there's double flush draw. There's going to be turns where there's one flush draw. There's going to be rainbow turn. And if you always play the same, like, oh, I'm going to bet with a draw and check without a draw, then suddenly on a rainbow board, you have no bluffs, right? And on a double flush draw board, you have way too many bluffs. And then some runouts have prettier or uglier airball candidates. So for example, on a double flush draw, queen high board, there's going to be a lot of overcard, flush draw blocker, this blocker, that blocker. But on a rainbow ace-high board, you can't have overcards ever. You can't have a flush draw blocker ever, right? So you're going to need to pick some other way, right? And both ways can't have the same standard, right? You can't have the same standard always for what the threshold is for betting. Scene says on a hard diamond spade club turn, we would want to bet clubs since they unblock the flop flow, or at least prefer it to hard say. Yes, I mean, that would be generally a decent heuristic. But again, those are just defaults that you can have, but you always have to keep an eye for the fact that your air composition is going to be very different depending on the spot. In some spots, you say, okay, I would rather have clubs, but I bet big on flop and I don't bet with clubs on flop big, right? So then what are you going to bet on turn, right? Or maybe you raise the flop. I raise the flop. Oh, I would rather have clubs. Right? But how am I going to raise the flop with clubs? I would just fold, right? So all of those heuristics always have a hole in them. I'm not saying the heuristics are bad. It's just they always have holes, and you have to be aware of it. So let's look at some runouts and compare some of the strategies. Or maybe instead of a 3, we can look at a deuce of hearts, and what we'll see is sizing goes down. Okay, why does the sizing go down? Well, there's many reasons, but one of the main reasons is because now we actually don't have a polar advantage that much. Our advantage now comes from good top pairs, over pairs, 2 pairs, and sets, those types. And because that's where our advantage lies, we're going to pick at a sizing that reflects that type of hand, which in this case is a smaller size, or of half pot, 3/4 bet, something like that, right? Even on a board like this, there's going to be some airball. For example, a king without a backdoor flush, right? King without a backdoor flush. Let's look at a different turn. Like, for example, what we talked about, the excess of pretty hands, right? 10 of diamonds, or even a 2 of diamonds. The 2 of diamonds, we have, quote unquote, an excess of pretty hands, because now there's like a lot more blockers that are like pretty. So you got to be careful, right? Now you see these hands are betting because they have the bold blockers. Now these are not. It changed. Our threshold, our standard for what constitutes pretty enough has changed, because our range now is more heavy on hands that can, quote unquote, look better, right? And I promise you, if we went to a rainbow board, in fact, we go to a rainbow flop, and the 2 keeps the board rainbow, the turn keeps the board rainbow, spades, and let's try to do the same sizing. Now, suddenly, the kinds of hands that do it changed, right? Now there's a lot more of these. Why? Because there's not as many of the others. Scene asks, what are some heuristics we can use on double flush draw turn? Well, on double flush draw turns, what's going to happen is what I just said, right? Let's say you want to bet, like in this case, 20% of your air balls, right? On a rainbow board, 20% of your air balls, if you try to pick the best air balls, it's just going to be basically king high, apparently, most king high. But on a double flush draw, what's going to happen is that you might have hands that look a lot prettier than that, like an ace X with a double blocker to the flush draws, even the lower, like Jack 9, 10, 9 with a double blocker to the flush draws. That's going to look a little bit like, that's just going to have better blockers, right? And so it's not so much about picking the right combos always. It doesn't really matter if you pick king high here or don't nail it. Like, it doesn't really matter. What I'm trying to illustrate is that it's very easy. If you have a heuristic that is very general, you are going to do it wrong on some board. You need your heuristic to be somewhat nuanced in order for you to not underbluff severely on certain runouts, not overbluff severely on other runouts, right? You know, if on the double flush draw you bet with king 3 of nothing, because why not? Then, you know, it's just too much. Okay. And as we said, there's going to be boards like the flop is ace high, right? Maybe the flop is ace high, and say there's a rainbow turn. And what's your heuristic for picking bluffs? Do you have one? Well, I don't know. Is it necessary that it's the same exact as the solver? Probably not, but you're going to need to bluff some of these. How do you pick them? I don't know, honestly. I don't know. But you need some plan. In fact, well, here, I mean, it's basically what you said before, where it prefers having either 1 spade or 2 spades because of unblocking the flop backdoors. But yeah, I mean, you need a plan. But suddenly, if we add flush draws and we add stuff, then having spades might not matter anymore, right? Because, oh yeah, you unblock the backdoor floats, but maybe you have some other way better, more important factor to take into account. Like before, where it was just like king high bet, right? It didn't care about backdoor flush draws, non-backdoor, just king high bet. So sadly, you can never generalize completely. Luckily, that's also an opportunity. Your opponents are not, this is, the things that we're talking about are the foundation of why it is impossible to play GTO. It's not even hard. It's just not remotely achievable by Linus. It's just not even possible. So all of these dynamics can become an actual strategical part of your game, like trying to exploit some of these things or trying to defend yourself from some of these exploits. Like those things can become part of the metagame. And now another thing I want to talk about is the frequency, right? We talked about how on some runouts, let's go back to the flush draw board. Some runouts, you're gonna have to bet more frequent. And so if you keep being stuck on this heuristic like king high is good or overguard, me want overguard, right? That's a very rigid heuristic. That doesn't work. And this is the reason all the time why lower stakes players struggle when they try to play GTO. Because if you are too rigid, it's not only not going to work, it's actually going to be worse than if you just use your brain, right? Because, for example, here, right? King comes, right? And we can see that betting frequency is very high. A GTO obsessed 25 and L player, 50 and L player, he might be like, me want overcard, me want unblockers to the thing. But the problem with that thought is that here our betting frequency is just too high. We just can't have that level of pickiness. See, like it's just almost everything. We can't be picky when we have to bet most of the air, right? So but that's why for some players, GTO seems to like not work. In fact, it works worse now when I just play normal, right? Why? Because if you just play normal, you see the king and you're like, I'm going to bluff because there's a king, right? That's a play that someone who has never heard of GTO could make. See the king, scary, bet. Right? You learn about GTO and you learn about, oh, now I want the overcard. Now I want this, the unblocker, the blocker, and now you start playing the hand worse than if you didn't know anything. So you have to be very careful about these things. Never allow the blocker to lead you astray of the obviously better play, right? Which is to bluff a lot on a king. On the flip side, if the turn was a 7, for example, or 5, you could probably guess that it's not that good. Lower frequency, and we see a lot of non-draws betting. And the reason is rather than because the board is not bad, the board is bad. But the reason you see even more airballs is because now we actually don't have as many of other things to bet, right? So now we have less draws. Maybe we need a few more airballs. Certainly, if we remove the donks, it's going to get pretty ugly pretty fast, at least somewhat. Maybe not to a crazy extent because the donks are rather low frequency. It's going to get even worse. And just a little bit worse. Just reduce the frequency by 2-3%. So all of these things matter, right? What's my overall betting frequency? Do I have a lot of draws? Do I not have a lot of draws? Do I have a lot of better air? Not air that looks good. Air that looks better than what I have right now, or not. All of those questions matter. And spoiler alert, you're not going to get it right? You're just not going to get it right. But you can try to do better than your opponents. You can try to pick up on what your opponents are doing wrong as well. Michael says all he needs is yes. That's the spirit. Potential leaks. So we talked about some of the mistakes that we could be making. And that already leads to a lot of exploits you could apply as the defender, right? We talked about what happens if you don't bet air. What happens if you don't bet merges? What happens if you bet too much air on some run out, not enough air on some other run out, right? But now let's talk about what are possible, not necessarily, but possible mistakes that our opponents could be making. One of them is the equity-driven defense that we talked about, where they fold too many of the quote-unquote normal bluff catchers that tend to be higher rank, and they call too much with the lower ranked bluff catchers that have higher extra equity. Well, a good exploit against that would be to merging a bunch. You start betting hands that are right in the middle, you're going to just printing money because they're going to fold anything better, not anything, but a lot of better things, and calling way too many worse. On the flip side, there's going to be the opposite type of player, maybe, where they defend too much based on the actual height of their pair, right? Oh, I have an underpair to, like, let's say it's a queen high board. I have tens, right? It's close to the queen, so I'm gonna call. But then a second pair, he folds, right? That might, I don't see that being as common or as intuitive. The first example seems way more possible to me, but I guess it could be possible. And in that case, we would want to merge less. Another possible mistake is absolute hand strength defense, meaning some players are going to have this general heuristic instead of like a board by board type strategy, or at least a bit of a more nuanced strategy. It's going to be just a sweeping statement, right? When I have second pair or higher, I call the barrel. And when I don't, I fold, right? That sweeping statement is going to lead to massive overfolding when, for example, an overcard comes, it's just going to overfold because they don't have that much second pair plus. They have second pair, but not that much top pair. And on the flip side, on some other cards, they might underfold. That's another really possible mistake that I could see happening at lower stakes. And then there's going to be just more obvious mistakes, right? There's just going to be people who fold too much. What do you do? Bluff air much. What do you do? Don't bluff air, right? The more obvious leaks are going to have also very obvious. So to summarize, second barrels have a certain set of building blocks: the value, the draws, there's the air, the merge, and you can't work out a proper range without all of them. I would say the mergers probably are the more accessory building block, but the air is certainly very important. The draws are certainly very important. The value and the mergers as well, specifically on certain boards, like some of the ones that we were looking at. The run out is going to dictate the size and frequency with every hand class, okay? And that leads to a bunch of ramifications, like I need to bluff with uglier hand, or I might need this blocker, but on this board, I actually don't need any blocker. I'm just going to bluff anyway. Or on this one, I need this really, really, really clear, strong blocker. On this one, I need a more, like a less strict blocker characteristic. Or, I mean, some people RNG everything. I'm not going to say it's completely wrong. You're definitely maybe missing on a little bit of EV, but, there's some people try to solve the problem by not even paying attention to their blockers. They're just like, I'm just going to bet however amount of air, and that way I can't get biased by there's a 2 flush draw or 1 flush draw or this or that. And make sure to exploit your opponent. Okay, always have an aggressive, not necessarily an aggressive in the sense of I play aggressively, raise and bet a lot. That's not really smart aggression. When I mean aggressive, I mean like an aggressive psychology. Think about your opponent's mistake. Try to capitalize on them. Don't just wait for them to make mistake. Right? I guess a better word would be proactive. Right? Be proactive in making your opponents lose. Don't just wait for them to lose. So, if you got any questions, make sure to ask in chat. And everyone else, see you in the next one. Hope you learned something. See you.